a couple of general comments before I begin. First of all, I want to say thank you to George for mentioning Tim Maudlin and Julian Barber, whom we'd hoped that they would both be here with us at this meeting. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to come in the end, but it's very nice to have them at least mentioned by name for their contributions on different sides of this debate. Second thing I wanted to say is to put what I'm going to be talking about in context against the background of Carlo's talk and George's talk, is that mine's a talk which, in a sense, could have been written in 1900. There's nothing relativistic, there's nothing quantum about what I'm going to be talking about. I mean, you might have got the impression from this morning that the problems with the view of time as flowing and passing and so on are problems which arise from, in particular, from relativity. But I think that, well, it may be true that there are new problems that arise from relativity. If philosophers, here I'm thinking perhaps particularly of philosophers at Trinity College, had kind of got their act together in the early 20th century, they could have got all this sorted out. To be fair, I think the blame has to be shared here between philosophers and physicists. I mean, the philosophers need to be blamed for being too slow and the physicists for being too fast and coming up with relativity and quantum theory, and sort of confusing the whole debate before the slow old philosophers had time to sort out the sort of philosophy of time related to the classical picture. But what I'm trying to do is to contribute to that latter old-fashioned classical debate here, and I hope it's of some use. So let's start with two views of time. These have been very much on the table in our discussions today, and I'm going to talk about them by stealing these pictures from the Scientific American. I think this must be an earlier issue of the Scientific American than the one that George was talking about, because I've been using these pictures for several years. In fact, I used them for about a year before I realized they came from the Scientific American, and then it turned out I was giving a talk, and George Musa, who some of you will know from the Scientific American, was in the audience, and he kindly pointed out to me that I'd in fact stolen them from them, or at least from somebody who'd stolen them from me. So that's why there's now a credit. Okay, so those are the two views, and let me just say a little about each independently. This is the so-called dynamic or passage view. And one of the things I'm going to stress in this talk is that, as it's often presented, this view combines three things which really need to be kept separate, because they're all independent. We can imagine versions of the view which had one, two, or three of them in pretty much any combination. So one of the messages of this talk is, if you do think something is missing from physics, you need to tell us which of these three things it is, or which combination you want to put back in. So these are the three things. One is the idea of a distinguished present moment, and George in particular has been talking about that. Here it's represented in this diagram by this slice. This is supposed to be the world line of the Earth. The spiral going around it is the world line of the Moon. The second is the idea of some sort of objective flow or passage, what Eddington called becoming. The idea that perhaps there's something essentially kind of dynamic about this picture which isn't captured by the block universe picture. And the third is the idea that there's an objective direction, that there's some sense in which one end of this is objectively the future and one end of it is objectively the past. And I'm going to talk about those three ideas independently, partly in order to make the point that they're different things, and the kinds of problems for them are different kinds of problems. Now, this picture, the dynamical passage view, is said to be a minority view among contemporary physicists, but as we can see, and as we know, it has had and still has some distinguished champions in physics. Yeah.
So on the picture in the title it says, only the present is real.
Yeah, so
that
that's...
distinguishes it from what George was talking about, in which the past is...
Yeah, so please...
Which do you mean?
That would be a further thing to add to the list. I'm not talking about that idea at all. So within views coming under one there, within views which think that present moment is real, you can distinguish several versions. One of them is what philosophers call presentism, which is that only the present exists. Another is what philosophers call the growing block view, and this is George's view, which is that the present is like the future boundary of something which is increasing in size. And there's a version of that where the present is, as it were, the boundary in the past of something which is shrinking. And then there's a view where the whole lot exists, and it's sometimes called the moving spotlight view, and sort of objectively picked out on this against the background of the four-dimensional block is one moment. So that, I mean, in the philosophical literature, all those kinds of views get distinguished. But since they all rely on the idea that there's a distinguished present moment, I can, for my purposes, group them together, because the argument I'm going to be looking at are arguments which are against that, so they count equally against all versions of that view. Good, thanks for that. Was a very useful question. Okay, now here's the so-called static or block view, which regards time as simply one dimension in a four-dimensional block. Now the first thing to be said about this is, of course, that it's not really static. I've been using this, but up here I put it in very large shutter quotes to indicate a very large shudder at the use of the term. Because if we're going to say that it's static or it's not changing, then the question arises, in what time is it not changing? Time is on the inside, so there's no time in which it's not changing. Here's somebody making a similar mistake. Here's somebody who's complaining that this so-called motion picture has no motion in it. Obviously, they're looking in the wrong place. There's a difference between that and this case, in that in this case, the person does have their own time in which they can say that the whole reel is static. In this case, we don't even have that. But the mistake they're making of looking for the motion in the wrong place is the same kind of mistake. Okay, but we can kind of characterize this picture by saying what's distinctive about it is that it rejects all three of those elements of the so-called dynamic view that I distinguished on the previous slide. As in these famous remarks, and I'm now going to give you some remarks by famous physicists, in which each of them individually is rejecting one of those three elements. And I'm doing this partly in order to emphasize how the elements are different. Here's Einstein with his old friend Michel Besso, and this is from a letter that Einstein wrote to the Reeve family of Besso when Besso died in 1955, just a few weeks before Einstein himself died. It says, for we convince physicists the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, albeit a persistent one. So this is clearly a rejection of the view that there's a distinguished present moment in some sense, which physics should be paying attention to. Okay, here's Hermann Weyl rejecting the idea that there's some sort of objective passage of time. He says, the objective world simply is, it does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness crawling upward along the lifeline of my body does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space which continuously changes in time. And this is from Weyl's philosophy of mathematics and natural science. Okay. Oh, and this is a sort of digression. I'm going to give you three physicists, but let's have a word from the poets. This is a late 19th century English poet called Austin Dobson. And these are just a few lines from a poem of his. Time goes, you say. I know. Alas, time stays. We go. Ours is the eye's deceit of men whose flying feet lead through some landscape low. We pass and think we see the earth's fixed surface flee. Alas, time stays. We go. So it's this idea of the passage of time as being some kind of illusion. Just to add a digression to a digression, I'm going to give you a few lines of another lovely poem by Austin Dobson. This is a poem called On the Hurry of This Time, written in 1885, where he's complaining about the pace of modern life. It says, with slower pen men used to write of old when letters were polite. They knew not steam. Electric light not yet had dazed their calmer sight. Too swiftly now the hours take flight. What's red at morn is dead at night. Isn't it wonderful? This is 100 years before email.
Some things never change.
Okay, so now away from that's enough poetry. Let's get back to physicists. And here's one of the most famous of all in this context. This is a passage from Boltzmann's lectures on gas theory in the late 1890s. The context is he's worried about the question. I mean, given that in effect he's discovered that a state of thermodynamic equilibrium is overwhelmingly the most likely world for a universe to be in. And there's this puzzling question as to why the world as we find it around us isn't in that sort of condition. And the possibility that he's discussing here is one which was apparently suggested to him by his assistant. He refers to as my old assistant, Dr. Schutz. It's that if the universe is infinite, then statistical fluctuations are going to produce low entropy occasionally, and very, very occasionally these will be, as it were, large enough to provide the kind of order that we see around us. So that's the context. Here's what he says. He says, in the universe, which is in thermal equilibrium throughout, so that's thermal equilibrium, and therefore there will occur here and there relatively small regions of the size of our galaxy which fluctuate noticeably from thermal equilibrium, and indeed the state probability in such cases will be equally likely to increase or decrease. So here's one of these fluctuations. You see it's increasing in one direction. Well, it's increasing. If you look to the right, it's increasing that way. If you look to the left, it's increasing that way.
What's the date of that quotation?
Pardon?
What's the date of that quotation?
1896, I think. It's on the next slide.
I just want to comment, it's very strange he talks about our galaxy, because we didn't know about our galaxy at that time.
Well, there's a puzzle for historians of science.
Some people believe in
Kant thought about galaxies.
it. But also he says state probability. I would have thought he'd say state entropy.
Well,
Probability is equally likely.
well, I think this is a quote from the standard translation of Lectures on Gas Theory. It's also in some. It's also. It's in other places. I think it may be in. There was a discussion in Nature in the 1895, 1896.
No, because this is not entropy. This is a probability of fluctuation out of equilibrium. So this is not defined.
Anyway, the quote goes on, and this.
Yeah, this might be the victim's plan.
This is the bit I'm actually interested in. He says, for the universe, the two directions of time are indistinguishable, just as in space there's no up and down. So he's making the point that Carlo was making this morning. However, just as in a particular place on the Earth's surface we call down the direction towards the centre of the Earth, so will a living being in a particular time interval of such a single world distinguish the direction of the time toward the less probable state from the opposite direction, the former towards the past, the latter towards the future. So what he means is that, well, if we live at a place like A, then we'll think of the future being to the right. If we live at a place like B, we'll think of the future as being to the left. And there's no objective right or wrong. It's just like up and down. Okay, so this is the illustration of the up and down case. You see, I was giving, this is a slide from a talk I was giving in Paris, and this is when I was in Sydney, so naturally I followed the Sydney convention of putting Sydney at the top. Convention I can share with George. I suppose Cape Town will be over here somewhere. I mean, we've long since got away from the idea that there's a notion of up and down, which is objective. We now think of it as associated with a particular point on the Earth's surface. Okay, so that's Boltzman rejecting the idea that there's an objective direction of time. So, if we want to reject the block universe picture, there are three ways we can do it. We can put in an objective present moment, we can put in an objective direction, or we can put in objective flow or passage. And I now want to present what I see as the kind of key difficulties to each of those three things. So, first question then is, does physics need an objective present? Here's an argument against, an argument that it doesn't need an objective present. Think about the future as described by your preferred physics. So, to make it a little bit more precise, suppose I ask you to tell me about the future from, say, midnight tonight. Let's take that as the starting point. Question, do we leave anything out if we don't say which moment in that future starting from midnight to now is the present moment? And obviously not, they all have an equal claim. So am I going to pick out Christmas Day as being the present moment, or New Year's Day, and if so, which year? As we describe the future, all moments are equivalent. Perhaps I should say, just as a digression here, I'm not particularly thinking of anything which depends on determinism or indeterminism. But if you're worried about that, if you like a sort of branching picture, then instead of asking you to describe the actual future, I'll ask you to describe a possible future along just one of the branches. And that will do equally well for the purposes of my argument here. Okay, so that's the question we asked today. Then I ask you to all come back tomorrow, and then we ask the same question about the past. I ask you to tell me about the history of the past. And again, I say, look, do we leave anything out of that description from a point of view of physics if we don't say which moment in the past was the present moment? Again, clearly not. It would be ridiculous to pick out one moment in the past as being the present moment. But now we've got two descriptions of two bits of the history of the universe which overlap, and it's easy to combine them so that we have a description of all of time without a distinguished present moment. And that's all the block universe is. It's just a description of all of time without a distinguished present moment. Okay, but just to make the point I want to make here a little bit more precise. Suppose someone who thinks that an objective present moment is missing from a physics of passage has a problem with their story about how time passed last week. Presumably they think that a full history of last week would mention the fact that time was passing last week. But as we've just seen, the story they tell about what was happening last week can't, on pain of absurdity, pick out one moment last week as being the present moment. So they're now in this bind. If they think that the objective present moment is important to the physics of passage, then they have to say that when they're telling us about the physics of last week, it's a story in which time is not passing. So I think the only sensible conclusion here is that if there is to be a new physics of passage, it's not going to be one that singles out the one moment as special. So that's the first of these three elements which kind of tend to be jumbled up in the conventional picture of the dynamic view. Okay, now to the question as to the direction of time. And here what puzzles me is that I can't see what it would mean for time to have a direction. It's a good, and George's reference to Tim Maudlin is a very useful kind of background here, because what Tim seems to mean by, Tim's standard example is to say, well, what it means to say that there's an objective direction of time is it means that there's a fact of the matter, say whether a particular asteroid is travelling from the Earth to the Mars or from Mars to the Earth. And I've got the same kind of distinction represented on my pictures here. I put it in a little arrow to indicate the way in which here the moon is supposed to be moving around the Earth. So this is supposed to be one possible view in which the moon is going that way. This is the other possible view in which the moon is going that way. So these correspond to what you see if you have a video of one and then play it backwards. But the question is, what would it take to make these different worlds so that there was a fact of the matter as to which one was the real world, rather than just two ways of representing the same world? So it's this question, what would it take, which is the question that I want to focus on. And the problem I have is that I can't see any answer which would be a good answer to that question. And we can think about that by thinking again about a spatial analogy. So here we have the sort of conventional picture of the Earth. There we have the upside down version that I gave you before. Here we have the mirror reverse version of the upside down one, and that's the mirror reversed version of the sort of left-right flipped version of the conventional one. A question. Suppose that God's deciding to create a universe which has just got the Earth in it, nothing else. Did he have to make a choice as to which one of those to create? Or did he just create one and we should think of the others as just being different representations of it? So that's the question. Are these really different worlds or are they just different views of the same world? And one part of that question is an old one in philosophy because it sort of goes back to Kant. Kant has the example of a world which just contains one hand. And I think Kant thinks that it does make sense to ask the question as to whether it's a left hand or a right hand. So I think Kant thinks that in effect, in that case, God would have a choice to make as to whether to create a left hand or a right hand. Yeah, Faye.
Is it fair to say that in asking this question, what would it take to say that the left-hand picture world is different from the right-hand picture world, where you put those arrows on it? That you're asking that question within a block universe?
No,
That's how it appears to me. And then maybe a different conception of physics. If we were presented with it, we would be able to say, yes, within this view of physics, that is what I mean by
Okay, so then the question I'm asking is, what would the extra ingredient of that physics have to be? Good.
good. So we have to.
Yeah.
But you're not saying that there can't possibly be any such.
No. Yeah,
But
good.
then you're saying.
So I mean, I don't see what could possibly do the trick, but I don't want to rule out a priori that there could be something. I'm just asking what it is and saying that for me, the most significant problem that I can see at this point is that whatever someone suggests, it doesn't look like it's going to do the job. And I'm going to make some gestures towards an argument for that in just a second. Nick.
Were you kind of asking a question about Kant there? So anyway, he says, whether you were or not, anyway, he says it's a different creative act to create a left hand.
Oh, good.
A single left
Good.
hand or a single right.
Good, thank you. It's always good to have some historically knowledgeable people in one's audience. And this is always good for me, since I'm so far from being one of those. Okay, now one point I want to make is that the fact that our world is spatially asymmetric, both top to bottom and left to right, as it were, that doesn't answer the question at all. Because it's no use saying that, I mean, as a labeling convention, of course we could say, well, the top is the hemisphere which has got more land in it. But think of it from God's point of view, and if what we're gesturing towards is the idea that there's an objective top, then surely God could have created a world in which it was the other way around, in which most of the land was at the bottom half. That's that one. And similarly for left-right. So nothing you can find apparently, as it were, on the surface of this planet is going to do this kind of job of making it the case that God has to make a choice between those four worlds rather than just creating one of them and letting difference of representation give us all the others. Okay. So going back to the question of time, the question is what would it take to make those different worlds? And one of the points I want to make, carrying over from the case of space, is that pointing to time asymmetries within the world, such as an arrow of thermodynamics, is no help at all. Because if you think that there's an objective difference between these two, then you've got an objective difference between the world in which the low entropy end is objectively at the past and the low entropy world is objectively at the future. And you're back with the question, what distinguishes those two worlds? And it's nothing to do with the entropy. So if the question you're interested in is this question about the objective direction, then appealing to entropy is of no interest. Although, of course, it may be of interest for answering different questions, asking what grounds, for example, our asymmetric experience of time or something like that. But if the question is about fundamental objective direction, entropy just doesn't do it for you. Okay, so what we're looking for is something to distinguish these two worlds, something to make it the case that God has to make a choice. If he's going to create a world like ours, a choice as to which is the objective direction of time. And Mark, could I say just one more thing just to explain this rather odd-looking slide? It has to be the right kind of difference. See, here's a case where God had to make a choice. He had to make a choice whether he wanted this rather lurid kind of world on the left or this much more sort of cool, calming one on the right. Maybe he had to make such a choice. Maybe there's a hidden colour property of the world, and so maybe there's a fact of the matter it's whether we live in that world or that world. But it's not a temporal difference. And so what we need if we're going to answer this, if we're going to put in an objective direction of time, is an answer to this question, what choice did God have to make? Which is an answer of the right kind to give us temporal directionality rather than some other kind of objective difference. between the two worlds. So the problem, I mean, just finding a choice for God to make doesn't solve the problem. It's got to be the right kind of choice.
Well, a tiny comment, which is sort of echoing Faye, that and your entropy example, bring in Leibniz. There are views in which, as it might be, there is some notion connecting the physical asymmetry of the world to the topness, or the entropy being low to the beginning. Because you might say that it's in the nature of God to create a world in which variety increases over time, a kind of teleological thing.
Yeah, no, that's right. So
if there could be a broader framework or a very detailed physical proposal that would do better than the mere colour.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree. So if there is to be an answer here,
Expands,
yeah,
we don't have something.
yeah. So it has to be an answer in effect, which makes the possibility that God could have done it the other way around somehow incoherent. Something.
Yeah, or at least it, not favoured. So we've got to make it not look like Gage anymore. It's got to look like there's a discursive, substantive difference, and he could have his reasons. Not just.
Well, well, maybe we need to come back to this in discussion. But his reasons about what? I mean, it's no good if what he has reasons about are just colour properties, because that's the wrong kind of thing. There are quite a lot of people wanting to ask questions, but I think I'm not far from the end, so I think I'll just finish and then we can have a proper Australian rules discussion period at the end. Okay, so now to the third question, the question about objective flow. And I'm just going to present the problem as I see it in the form of a dialogue. And it's picking up on the thing that George mentioned about the question as to if time passes, how fast does it pass? And it's a dialogue between two classical proponents of the two sides of this debate, Parmenides and Heraclitus. So Parmenides, who's on the side of the block universe in modern terms, says to Heraclitus, if time passes, how fast does it pass? And Heraclitus relies at 1 hour per hour, like duh. I've updated the example, the dialogue a little. And Parmenides says, Parmenides says, isn't it a problem that no other answer makes sense? Doesn't it suggest that it wasn't a question about anything we could actually discover, anything of interest to physics? Heraclitus says, no, it's a feature, not a fault. It just is obvious that time passes. So we want the answer to the question, how fast does it pass, to be an obvious one. At this point, Parmenides says, you mean unlike space? And Heraclitus says, well, yes, like duh again. Of course, time is different from space. Then Parmenides makes his smart move. He says, doesn't space extend west, say, at 1 meter per meter? In other words, if you move a meter west, then you've travelled a meter to the west, right? Heraclitus is kind of getting impatient at this point, as you see. Says, sure, but I don't think this conversation is going anywhere. Get it? And Parmenides says, but then what's the difference between time and space? This notion of rate of change is so trivial that it applies to both in its own terms. And we've no longer got anything which can be a kind of distinctive characteristic of time rather than space. So I think there's a dilemma here for somebody who wants objective flow. They need their notion of flow to be non-trivial so that we don't get the corresponding kind of thing in the case of space. But the suggestion that the answer to the question can only be 1 hour per hour doesn't look like it's going to give them that.
There's the question of the error. For time it can only go plus 1 second
per
second, whether space can go minus 1 meter per meter.
George, I think that's related to the question of objective direction. So if we don't have an objective direction, so a view according to which there's no objective present and no objective direction, but just passage, doesn't care about which way the passage is going. That's not objective, but just says there's something essentially kind of dynamic or flow-like about time. So to give that reply, in other words, you need to, as well, you need a response on point 2 as well, I think.
It's not minus minus 1 meter in this direction.
Oh, yes.
It's minus 1 over minus 1. So the rate comes out.
Right.
Okay, I'm almost finished, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so for discussion. Okay, so now before my conclusions, I just want to give you a brief passage from what I think is one of the most wonderful papers on this topic, a paper by D.C. Williams from 1951 called The Myth of Passage. Beautifully written paper. This is just a small snippet from near the end. Williams says, "Let us hug to us as closely as we like that there is a real succession, that rivers flow and winds blow, that things burn and burst, that men strive and guess and die. All this is the concrete stuff of the block." Williams uses the term manifold, but what he's talking about is the four-dimensional picture. "All this is the concrete stuff of the block, the reality of serial happening, one event after another, in exactly the time spread which we've been at pains to diagram." This is in the picture of the block. What does the theory allege except what we find, and what we find that is not accepted and asserted by the theory? Suppose a pure intelligence bred outside of time, instructed in the nature of the block and the design of the human space-time worm, with its mnemic organization and the strands of world history which flank it, and suppose him incarnated among us. What could he have expected the temporal experience to be like, except just about what he actually discovers it to be? How, in brief, could processes which endure and succeed each other along the timeline appear as anything other than enduring and successive processes? So the point that Williams is making here is that the everyday experience to which proponents of the passage view appeal in support of their view is precisely what you would expect a block view to look like from the inside. Williams is kind of expressing puzzlement at what the claim is when something is said to be missing from the block view. Okay, so here's the summary. What I've done is to note 3 different things that might be thought to be missing from the block picture: an objective present, an objective direction, or objective flow or passage. Adding any one of these would add something to the block, would amount to showing that the physics of the block is incomplete. I mean, if we had an argument that physics needed any of these things. But all 3 of those ways of departing from the block face problems, as I've argued. Though it's important to realize that they're different problems in each case. And unless we keep these 3 things distinct, we simply can't see. So one of the characteristics of arguments in this territory, I think, is that people keep on talking at cross purposes because they get these things confused with one another. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Would you like to run a proper discussion for me, and so then you can keep a queue?
Yeah.
Because we've got about 20 minutes, I think.
Well, Josh, you've got a question now. I lost you somewhere, I think, when you talked about direction. And I wanted to ask just a question of clarification about what you mean by direction, because I think that so many of these terms, like direction or arrow or symmetry, and some people mean the same thing by those words and other people don't. And I happen to think that the direction of time was merely some criterion which would distinguish the future from the past direction. 2 different directions you can identify about linear ordering. And for many people, that would sort of coincide with, or would be highly relevant in that context, to find out whether the laws of physics are time reversal invariant or not. So for example, if you're studying trajectories which are solutions of the diffusion equation, you will readily find that reversing time will transform the solution into a non-solution. So we say that equation singles out the reverse direction. There are other equations of physics which don't do that. But so it's a meaningful question to ask whether the laws of physics are time reversal invariant or not. And so by that token, the idea of does it have any meaning to say that time has a direction? would have to be answered yes. But in your point of view, you say that asymmetries
Exactly.
don't add anything. to it.
Exactly.
So you must mean something different.
Yeah, what I'm trying to mean is what Maudlin says he means, which is that there's some fact of the matter as to whether we live in a world in which the asteroid is going from Mars to Earth, rather than a world in which the asteroid is going from Earth to Mars. So Tim apparently thinks that what it would take would be some fact which means that one representation is the correct representation, the other is the incorrect representation, and this is my little version of that choice.
Maybe just for clarification, it'll help. I mean, the distinction is between everything, the inverted sequence of absolutely everything.
Thank you.
Not just the aspect.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so
Can I respond to that? It's a different question to say one of these representations is right and the other one is wrong. And the other question is, are these representations different representations? Is it meaningful to say that they are different? That's a different question, I would say.
Well, in some sense, they're different by definition. You can just see this one represents the.
But the question below it says that you question whether they're different.
No, I don't question whether they're different representations. I question whether they represent different worlds.
Did you? Yes. I would like to suggest actually that this is a frame of reference problem, and that the problem is, in a way, I mean, obviously these are different representations perspectively, but the problem, it seems to me, is whether we take time to be a frame of reference, or whether we want to try to situate time in whatever time is, in some other frame of reference which gives it directionality.
Well, yeah, good.
Well, let me just finish. Yeah. So if we take our own conceptualizations of our experience, we have a frame of reference in English in which we move towards the future in our imaginations and in the way that we talk about it, which is not true for all cultures. And apparently there are Andean cultures in which people see the future as behind them, okay? And apparently the ancient Greeks also saw it that way. But in this case, the timeline is a frame of reference for me to understand my place in time. But if you want to say that there is something inherent about time which gives it directionality, you're asking for something else. You're saying, I want a frame of reference which gives this directionality to my frame of reference.
Yeah, I think I agree. I
don't see. I mean, of course, you could say that local complexification, negative entropy, is one answer to that. But then it's.
No, I think we're on the same side here. I think you're sharing my puzzlement as to what an answer to this question could possibly be, of the way in which, of the kind that somebody who thinks that there is an objective direction in some frame-independent sense thinks that there is.
Yes, I have Wayne, then Jeremy, then Chris.
Thanks for doing it. I enjoyed this. So your challenge to the opponents of a block universe is who say that there's something missing, either objective direction or objective flow, is to say what they mean by what it is that's missing.
No. My answer is different in each case for all the three cases. In the case of direction, that's the one which comes closest to saying what it means.
Okay, so let's take that with sort of suggestion that it doesn't actually mean anything. Well, the question then is, suppose that's right, then if there isn't anything it could mean to say that these are different worlds. Similarly, it doesn't mean anything to deny it. And my worry, and actually it's not a worry, but actually a hope, I guess, is that there actually is not a dispute between proponents and opponents of the block universe after all.
Well, but then there's a kind of who wins question, And of course, my hope is that it's really the proponent of the block universe.
Well,
I mean, that's, so,
wait, if there's no dispute, then there's nothing to win.
but no, that's not quite true, because I mean, there's a kind of common thing that we all share, and then the question is whether there's something extra that we can dispute about. And I want to argue that there isn't anything extra that we can dispute about, and that means that it's the base thing, the thing we share, which is the block, that wins.
Jeremy.
Well, my comment is actually a bad joke echo of wise man Wayne Mirville's fictitious question. And that is, I really love the talk, but this myth of passage, which I'm afraid I never read, I enjoyed that quote, and I was thinking here, but one has to be careful who one has as friends. Because isn't it true that Wittgenstein is meant to have amazed his peers by saying, you say that people resisted Copernicanism because it looks as if the sun rises and goes around the earth. But I, the great Ludwig, point out to you, what would it have looked like if it looked as if the earth went around the sun? Thou very same, brother, right? Clever Ludwig. Similarly, in our own day, dear beloved friends who are Everettians, keep telling me, hey, you've got to come to our side, man, because look, what would it have been like if it was an Everettian world? Hey, think it through, read my book, says David Wallace. You'll see it would look like this macro real stuff. So, I just not with Ludwig, and I would love to be with David, but I can't be, and so I'm just worried that. Bad joke.
You're worried that I'm making the yeah. So I guess the moral here in all these cases is that the issue has to be decided not in phenomenological terms, but in some other terms, it comes elegance, best explanation, something like that. But then no, I think it's clear that it's going to be the block which wins.
Is that a finger or a hand?
Hand was a hand.
Okay,
That's self-addressed.
is that a finger?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
So I want to expand on what Jeremy said. For some purposes, which are the purposes more of a working physicist, it's not so much important the descriptive answer, but the heuristic consequences of your answer. And I think the Copernicus thing illustrates that perfectly. If they already understood the dynamics of the solar system, maybe they would argue forever over whether it was heliocentric or geocentric. But they didn't. And one view was much more fruitful for leading to the correct dynamics.
Yeah.
And I think exactly the same thing can be true. I mean, if you're looking for a practical meaning or another, objective kind of meaning, I think the same is here. Someone who believes in a evolving block universe or some becoming kind of picture will be led to make certain kinds of theories, whereas someone who believes the block universe will be led in another direction. It's not absolute one way or another.
Okay,
The
so
believer can go either direction, but there's a definite correlation. To some extent, I think that's the question we're really asking.
Okay, good.
What's the fruitful direction for quantum gravity?
Good.
And I'll argue on Friday that the notion of gross dynamics that comes with causal sets is much more consonant with the evolving or the...
Okay, good. That's excellent. I mean, because and I'm very curious to know whether, as it were, that turns out to be right. And I agree that if it turns out to be right, it could be something which could sort of open up some space here. My sort of hunch is that just as in the passage I quoted from D.C. Williams there, the claim is that all this stuff which is supposed to be incompatible with the block is in fact precisely what's predicted by the block. My sort of guess, without knowing any of the details, would be that was likely to turn out to be true in the case you described too. But I'll be very interested to see, to the extent that I can understand it, how you think that's not the case.
In the Copernicus case, would you say that in the end it was all compatible with the theory we have now was all compatible with the geocentric view?
Well, in that case, I think that there's a clear advantage to the heliocentric view. I mean, it's a sort of explanatory advantage.
So they could have seen that before they had the Newtonian gravity.
I'm not sure how much of.
Newtonian gravity.
Yeah, I think they saw it. They did see it before they had Newtonian gravity, didn't they?
So you think there was an objective decision?
Yeah, yeah. And that's the sort of standard story of the history.
Yeah.
Well, there's no
One step
But I do think we need to be. I mean, it may be that there's a difference between that kind of case and the sort of case we're describing here. I mean, in that kind of case, you could assume that both sides were agreeing that there was a sort of absolute space which had a center, and that gave them a meaningful disagreement about where the center was. In this case, I mean, part of the problem is that, at least in the case of direction, and I think it's also true in the case of the notion of objective present, it's hard to really make sense of what the alternative position actually is. I mean, and I want to say that about the growing block, because insofar as the growing block involves picking out one moment of time, or one moment of time along a word line as being objectively special, I can't see how that's compatible with what I took to be fairly obvious points I made about the story we tell about how things happened in the past, where we don't pick out any such time.
Actually, I had a question on this, because I wanted to get clear about the dialectic of the argument. It sounded to me like what you produced was an argument targeted specifically at the growing block version of broadly speaking in A theory.
No, I didn't intend it to be like that. I intended it to be, as I said in answer to Faye's question, I intended it to target all the views which pick out one moment as special.
I don't have any particular sympathies for presentism. Couldn't the presentist just say, you've set up the example in the wrong way, because the past doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist, so there isn't such thing as...
So I go to the presentist and I say, tell me what's going to happen after midnight. And they come back to me and said, midnight doesn't exist, man. Nothing's going to happen. Now, that's obviously not the kind of answer they want to give. What they want to do is to translate all the ordinary sorts of things we'll say about what's going to happen next week or tomorrow into their presentist picture. But they're still going to, they're still going to have some story about what all of that stuff means. And similarly, when we ask tomorrow about history, they're going to have some story about what all the past tense stuff means, and then we get the block by putting together those two descriptions.
Are all presentists hippies? They are totally good. So I have George and then Nick.
Can we go back to this runabout?
Oh, actually, I was thinking on.
Oh, you also?
Yeah.
Okay.
On Jeremy, but let's go on past that, I think. Well, you're back there, just to say, it seems that the right way to think of what Williams was saying is not an argument for the block universe, but a reply to an argument against the block universe. So the phenomenological point doesn't pick either way, but the reply to the people who say, if the block universe were this way, you'd expect some strange appearance other than one we actually get.
Yeah.
Who says, well, no, that's not how it is. But you shouldn't say, wow, isn't this exciting? Block universe predicts our experience. You should just say, experience is not the basis of doing these decisions.
Yeah. No, I mean, on this view, what Williams is doing is what presumably some of the 3rd century BC Greeks were doing if they gave sensible answers to the worries about what it would feel like if there were people at the other end of the planet.
Can we go back to that one about the problem about talking about what happened yesterday?
Okay, so that's this way in time, isn't it? Yeah. So I had 2 slides on this. This was the second one.
I simply can't relate to this argument. So the instances the present keeps changing. So last week it was the present. It's not the present.
Which day last week was the present? There were 7 days.
Which day you're talking about? You can go back to any day.
Okay, but then you haven't picked out. Then you haven't picked out one day as special. I mean, look, within the George, within the block, I can of course pick out any day and say, look, let's suppose that was last Wednesday. I can use that as a representation of how things seem from the perspective of last Wednesday. But speaking from today, we don't think that that representation has any priority over the one which has that further to the left, which is the,
Correct, absolutely correct.
yeah. But then what are we disagreeing about?
We're disagreeing. This instant which we are now talking about is present. All of the ones in the past were the present. They're not the present now. They all equally were the past, present at one moment. I don't know what your problem is.
But then we're back in effect saying, or I'm saying what Williams was saying, that all of this extra stuff you claim needs to be added to the block is all there in the block anyway, and the block has got all these times in it, each of which is present from its own point of view.
Each of which was the present at that time.
Yeah.
So we have two fingers here, but
I just want to carry on. The question is, why does the past exist? It's because, for instance, in this room there's carbon. Where did that carbon come from? It was made in stars at a certain time in the past when a nuclear reaction took place. So that's why the past affects the present. So my viewpoint is you must assign a reality to anything which can be shown to have a causal effect on what is here and now. So the past has to be said to exist. You can't make the same claim for the future because the things in the future don't have any discernible effect on what's happening in this room at this moment.
Okay, well, now you've introduced some things which I didn't talk about, the direction of causality and so on. I mean, I'd be happy to discuss those at some other time. But when I was giving the future version of this argument, on the previous slide, I pointed out that since I didn't want it to depend on issues of determinism and indeterminism, I was quite happy to read the argument in terms of, so the question is, tell me how the future might be, and then to just pick out one branch. And in that branch, no moment will be picked out as the present moment, and each will be present at its own time. I mean, another way of expressing the point that I'm getting at here is that the picture of the present moment as being objectively distinguished tries to combine two things. One is it tries to, on the one hand, it's something exclusive, the idea that one moment is the present moment. The other is something inclusive, the idea that every moment gets its turn. And I think that fundamentally those two things are incompatible. I think that's the right way to as it were, bring out the good point that's behind McTaggart's argument, going back to Trinity philosophers in the early 20th century.
Faye, did you sort of have a...
I'm not sure, but I have this feeling that your vision of physics is a static one, and therefore that question of what would it make to make this universe different from the other universe, it doesn't mean anything. I just want to tell you a little anecdote, which is just nice. There's an old TV show about Stephen Hawking, filmed at a time when he could still speak, although he wasn't. I mean, his speech was so indistinct that his speech was interpreted by his students who understood him and then told everyone what he was saying. So he's giving a lecture and he's talking about the Einstein static universe, and it's just a cylinder. So he has this cardboard cylinder on the table, and it falls off by accident. So his student comes and puts it back on the table, and then Stephen says something to his student, and his student goes over to the cylinder and he turns it upside down and says, "Stephen says I had it upside down." So this picture that you have of the two universes, would it, suppose we had some theory of physics which doesn't exist yet, I mean some successful theory of physics in which there was a process, a growing block universe model of physics in which there's a process of space-time being built up, then your pictures can't capture, they're static. I mean, you're showing us these static pictures.
Okay, good.
The pictures cannot represent that process. The process in itself is part of the physics, which you can't show us, and I kind of feel that you're not thinking of that as part of the physics.
Okay, so
you're thinking of the thing that is produced by that process as being the physics, but the process itself is also part of the physics. If we had such a theory, would it then distinguish between those two universes? Because one would be built up from the left to the right, the other one would be built up from the right to the left.
Good.
They would, to me, be different physics.
Good. Okay, so I mean, in effect, in that question, we've got two of the I mean, two of the kind of things I was talking about, the objective now and the objective direction, they're both in that question. So in order to have a picture in which there is an objective process of building up, a sort of growing block, then you do need to pick out the objective present. And so you need, sorry?
I claim that's not the case, but...
Oh. But haven't you got the notion of it being, as it were, there's an objective boundary between existence and non-existence?
You'll have to wait till...
Okay. And so, well, so what I've been going to say was that obviously I haven't understood your proposal, but it seemed to me that it required an objective present. But then, even if you had that, or if you don't need it, then there's still a question as to whether there's an objective distinction between, as it were, the growing block and the view according to which what's actually happening is it's shrinking rather than growing. And that's the question about direction.
Wayne and John, I know you had things, but Nick and Carlo have been waiting for a while.
Okay, I'll leave you to the break.
Yeah. Nick?
How much longer are we going?
A couple of minutes, 2 minutes. Is it a
So,
biggie?
okay, so the session was kind of going back to a discussion. So, I have sort of a sub-question, but then so this is to do with the time reversal symmetry. Do you think that would you make the same argument for, say, the universe being anisotropic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so. I mean, look, this thing is spatially anisotropic, both up and down and left to right, and we could make it a law-like matter if we like, modify the story so that
So here's a line of thought that goes back to Joost that applies to all these cases.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly we think it's possible that the laws could have been time asymmetric.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Absolutely. And
here's the extra little bit of thought was that then there has to be some additional structure to time in virtue of which we can have this temporal anisotropy. Now, why couldn't I have a world in which the laws were symmetrical and yet time still had that extra bit of that extra feature? So
where you lost me is when you said clearly it has to be the case that there has to be some extra ingredient to time. That's what I can't see.
I said that was how I was. Okay, so how do you understand it without having some extra structure?
You understand it. I mean, you could put some imaginary laws on this, so the laws are different at one end than at the other. That doesn't help at all with the question that we're asking at this point. It doesn't require that. I mean, maybe it requires that space has a different structure at one end than the other end, but it doesn't tell you anything about which end is kind of, the question as to whether God had to choose between those two worlds. Because, this could be just the extra structure, suppose it's up at that end, in this picture it's down at that end. Have we answered the question as to what it would take for these to be two different worlds? I don't think we have.
We do have time for just one. Carlo, did you see that one? Sorry, but...
This is Hannes.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, it's... Sorry?
That's okay, go ahead.
I'm right now. I think I agree entirely with what you're saying. So if I understood correctly, I don't have any objection. So my question is neither objection nor a comment. It's just I want to understand better how far you're going and what you're exactly saying. The question is actually, are you saying that there's no interesting question after a certain point regarding, for instance, what makes an Northern Hemisphere, what the cause of the Northern Hemisphere goes in genotypes? So can we make a story that accounts for the Northern Hemisphere being different?
No, I didn't say anything about causation or explanation, anything like that.
So would somehow, I agree that this block universe, your main point, if I get it correctly, is that the block view is not in contradiction with thinking about evolution in time. Of course, this time is there.
Yeah.
It's not in contradiction with thinking there are processes, because that's what
they're
being described, processes.
Exactly.
And so on and so forth. Okay? I think it's still, once we think that view, now, in my talk, I left some some open doubt with respect to block universe. There's a stronger, yeah, that's what I want to say. There's a stronger in the market sense in which people subscribe to block universe, saying that there's nothing else interesting to be asked about the future being different from the past. Not in the sense you're saying. I mean, in the sense in which can we give a scientific account of the fact that there's no uniformity between.
No, I'm not claiming that.
Right.
And I mean, for one thing, as I said, I was speaking to you from 1900, and so wasn't saying anything about all the interesting physics, which has kind of been done since that point.
And couldn't this additional physics that we might interest in, that's, I mean, I think there is some additional thermodynamical story relating to our subjective distinctions about past and future and so on and so forth. Couldn't it help clarifying the origin of some confusion about the notion of present in some sense?
Oh yeah, no, certainly a kind of fuller story for why the people I'm disagreeing with think the way they do.
Yeah.
Would of course it would need to appeal to the sort of things that you want to do. Yeah. I mean, of course, we might find some points in the detail where we did want to disagree about something.
Yeah.
But we agree on what the general program is, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Wayne. Let's thank you again.